July 9th, 1944. For 22-year-old Fumiko Nakamura, the world had ended. Below her, a 250-foot drop to volcanic rocks that jutted from the sea like broken teeth. Behind her, the unstoppable American war machine grinding through the last defenders of Saipan. And all around her, hundreds of terrified Japanese civilians being herded toward the edge of Marpi Point by an Imperial Army officer whose voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "The Americans are beasts," he screamed, his uniform somehow still immaculate despite 3 weeks of brutal combat. He stood on a boulder, his sword raised high, his face twisted with the kind of fervor that came from absolute certainty. "They will torture you, they will defile your women and daughters. They will make you slaves worse than animals. Death is honor. Death is loyalty to the emperor. Jump, and your spirits will live forever in Yasukuni Shrine." The wind howled across the cliff's edge, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke from distant fires and the salt spray from waves crashing against the jagged rocks far below. Fumiko stood frozen, her bare feet cut and bleeding from the 3-mile forced march through the jungle. Her nurse's uniform, once white and pressed, now hung in filthy tatters. Her mind struggled to process what her eyes were witnessing. Around her, mothers clutched infants to their chests. Old men who could barely walk supported each other as they shuffled forward. Young girls, some no older than 12, held hands in trembling chains. Everyone moved toward the edge as if pulled by invisible strings. Fumiko had heard these words before. For years, the radio broadcasts, the newspapers, the neighborhood association meetings back in Kagoshima all had repeated the same message over and over, until it became the rhythm of daily life. Americans were demons with white skin and cruel eyes. They ate the flesh of prisoners. They laughed as they tortured children. To be captured was a fate worse than any death imaginable. But as she stood there, the wind whipping her hair across her face, something inside her hesitated. She watched a young mother, couldn't have been older than 25, walk calmly to the edge. The woman's child was wrapped in what had once been a beautiful silk cloth, now stained with mud and blood. The mother didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked forward and was gone. And for one horrible suspended moment, Fumiko saw her face. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't serene. It was absolutely, utterly terrified. The screaming began in earnest then, not screams of pain, but screams of pure, primal fear that all the propaganda in the world couldn't cover up. Bodies fell like rain. The sound would haunt Fumiko for the rest of her life. An old woman grabbed her arm, fingers digging in like claws. "Jump with me, girl," she hissed. "We go to the emperor together." But Fumiko couldn't move. Her legs had turned to stone. Then came the explosion. An American grenade thrown by Marines who were desperately trying to stop the mass suicide detonated 50 yards away. The blast broke the spell. Fumiko ran not toward the cliff but away from it, stumbling through the jungle as the officer screamed, "Traitor! Behind her!" She ran until her lungs burned, until she collapsed in a shell crater, covered in mud, and her own vomit, waiting for the Americans to find her and begin whatever horror came next. The darkness came fast in the jungle. Fumiko lay in that crater for what felt like hours, but might have been days. Time had lost all meaning. Her throat was raw from thirst, her feet throbbed with infection, and every sound, every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent waves of terror through her body. When the Marine finally appeared above her, silhouetted against the morning sky, Fumiko closed her eyes and waited for the end. "It's okay," a young voice said in English. "You're okay. Medic. We need a medic here." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was concerned, almost gentle. The impossibility of it broke something inside her mind. That was July 28th, 1944, 19 days after Marpi Point. 19 days of hiding in the jungle, drinking rainwater from leaves, eating nothing, slowly dying from exposure and terror. When the Americans pulled her from that shell crater, she weighed 83 pounds. What came next was even more impossible than the rescue. They took her to a place called Camp Susupe, a massive tent city on the coastal plain that had been erected with startling efficiency in the weeks following the battle. Rows and rows of canvas structures stretched as far as she could see, housing over 20,000 Japanese civilians who had either surrendered or, like Fumiko, been captured while fleeing the mass suicides. The processing was designed to be non-threatening, but for prisoners conditioned to expect brutality, every step was terrifying. Fumiko was led to a tent where American medics, some of them women, which shocked her almost as much as anything else, examined her wounds. They were gentle. They cleaned her cuts with iodine that stung but didn't burn like she expected. They bandaged her feet with clean white gauze. They gave her water in a metal cup and a protein bar that tasted like sweet cardboard but was more food than she'd seen in a month. Then came the DDT tent. She was led to a large canvas structure where she had to remove her filthy clothes and stand while soldiers sprayed her from head to toe with white powder. She thought this was it. This was the beginning of the torture. The powder was poison or some kind of chemical weapon designed to make her suffer slowly. But a Japanese-American woman in a US Army uniform speaking perfect, unaccented Japanese knelt down beside her and explained softly. "It's just to kill the lice," Sergeant Grace Hoshino said, her voice kind. "To prevent disease. We're trying to keep everyone healthy. You're safe now." Safe. That word again. It made no sense in the world Fumiko understood. She was assigned to Tent 7 in Section C of the camp, a large canvas structure that housed 30 women. She was given a cot, a thin mattress, a blanket, and a set of clean civilian clothes. Not a uniform, just simple, clean garments. The Americans even provided feminine hygiene products which Fumiko hadn't seen in over a year. Every detail of the camp seemed designed to contradict everything she had been told, but Fumiko's mind couldn't process it yet. She moved through those first days in a fog of exhaustion and confusion, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to reveal itself as the elaborate trick she'd been warned about. The other women in Tent 7 whispered constantly, sharing stories of the battle, of the suicides, of the strange, almost boring normality of their captors. Most of them were terrified, but cautiously hopeful. They helped each other. They shared what little they had. They tried to make sense of their survival, but there was one woman who sat apart from all of them. Reiko Ishida was perhaps 29 years old, though it was hard to tell. She had a lean, angular face, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to cut through everything they looked at. While the other women talked in hushed, frightened voices, Reiko sat on her cot in absolute silence, her back perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap, radiating an intensity that made everyone uncomfortable. She never went to the showers when the other women did. She never joined their whispered conversations. She never cried, never showed fear, never showed anything at all except a cold, perfect stillness that reminded Fumiko of a coiled snake. Miyamoto, an elderly woman who slept 3 cots away from Fumiko, tried once to befriend Reiko. She approached with a gentle smile, offering to share some rice she'd saved from the mess tent. Reiko looked at her with such contempt that Mrs. Miyamoto actually took a step back, fear flashing across her weathered face. "You shame yourselves," Reiko said quietly, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You shame the Emperor. You shame everyone who died with honor." After that, no one tried to speak to her. Fumiko watched Reiko with a mixture of fear and fascination. Part of her recognized that this woman represented everything she had been, everything she was supposed to be. The loyal subject who would rather die than accept kindness from the enemy. Reiko was a ghost of the old world, a walking reminder of all of the imperial ideology that had led so many to the cliffs. But another part of Fumiko, the part that was growing stronger every day in the strange reality of Camp Susupe, looked at Reiko and saw something different. A woman trapped in a cage of ideology, unable to accept evidence that contradicted her worldview, even when that evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The days passed in a strange rhythm. Wake at dawn to the sound of American reveille. Breakfast in the mess tent, actual rice, and sometimes canned vegetables. Work details that were voluntary, not forced, cleaning the camp or helping in the medical tents. Afternoons of exhausted rest, evenings of whispered conversations, and prayers for the dead. And through it all, the transformation was happening, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The children were the first to crack. Within 2 weeks, Fumiko saw them laughing again, playing simple games with each other occasionally, even approaching the American guards with the fearless curiosity of the very young. The guards, many of them fathers themselves, responded with the kind of gentle kindness that seemed to come naturally to young men far from home who missed their own children. One afternoon in late August, Fumiko witnessed a moment that crystallized everything. A 6-year-old boy named Tetsuo had been deeply traumatized by the battle. He refused to speak or eat for days. His mother was desperate, trying everything to reach him, but the boy just sat with vacant eyes, unreachable in whatever dark place his mind had retreated to. An American corporal named Sullivan, a red-haired kid from Boston who couldn't have been older than 19, noticed the boy sitting alone near the edge of the tent area. Sullivan approached slowly, non-threateningly, and pulled out a chocolate bar from his pack. He unwrapped it carefully, broke off a piece, and popped it in his own mouth, exaggerating how delicious it was, rolling his eyes in theatrical pleasure. Then he offered a piece to Tetsuo. The boy stared at it like it was a poisonous snake. Sullivan smiled, broke off another piece, and this time handed the entire bar to the boy's mother. Then he just walked away, not waiting for thanks, not expecting anything, just a simple act of kindness offered freely. 10 minutes later, Fumiko watched as Tetsuo took his first bite of chocolate. The transformation on his face was immediate. Shock, then wonder, then pure joy that seemed to light him from within. He began to cry, but this time not from trauma, from relief, from the simple, overwhelming experience of something sweet in a world that had been only bitter for so long. His mother watched her son, and then she turned to look at the American corporal walking away in the distance. And Fumiko saw something break in the woman's face. It was the last wall falling, the last defense against the truth crumbling into dust. The next day, Tetsuo was laughing again. For the women, the transformation came through different channels. The showers were installed in the second week of August, simple canvas enclosures with pipes that brought clean water heated by the tropical sun. After months of living in filth, of feeling less than human, the ability to actually bathe with real soap, to wash their hair, to feel clean again, was psychologically profound. Fumiko stood in the shower area one evening, watching women weep as they washed their hair for the first time in months. And she understood with sudden clarity that this wasn't just about hygiene, it was about dignity. It was about being treated like human beings again, instead of animals or enemies. Mrs. Miyamoto stood beside her, tears mixing with the shower water, and whispered, "I thought I would die dirty. I thought that was how it ended." But it hadn't ended. They were alive. They were clean. And slowly, impossibly, they were beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, everything they'd been told was a lie. August 3rd, 1944, dawned hot and humid like every other day on Saipan. But the energy in Camp Susupe was different, electric. Word had spread through the tents the night before. Something new was opening today, something near the center of the camp. Fumiko joined the line that morning with the same numb obedience that had carried her through the past weeks. She didn't expect much. Perhaps a ration of rice, perhaps some salt, Perhaps another small demonstration that the Americans were trying in their strange way to keep their prisoners alive and reasonably healthy. What she found instead was impossible. The structure was housed in a large tent bigger than any of the residential tents, with a hand-painted sign in English and Japanese that read, "Canteen." The line stretched for hundreds of yards, a slow-moving snake of curious, frightened, hopeful prisoners. When Fumiko finally reached the entrance and stepped inside, she felt her knees go weak. The tent's interior was stacked floor to ceiling with goods, not military rations, not scraps, real goods. Canned peaches in heavy syrup, the kind she hadn't seen since before the war started. Canned pineapple chunks, bars of soap that actually smelled like flowers. Toothbrushes. Candy, actual candy wrapped in colorful paper. Cigarettes, sewing kits, cooking oil, salt and sugar in abundance. Condensed milk in small cans with cheerful labels. The sight of it made Fumiko dizzy. Japan had been starving for years. The home islands had been under blockade since 1942. She hadn't seen most of these items since she was a teenager, and here they were, stacked in impossible abundance in a prison camp offered to the enemy. Mrs. Miyamoto stood in front of Fumiko in the line. The old woman reached the counter with trembling hands and pointed at a can of peaches, her voice barely above a whisper. "How much?" The American soldier behind the counter, a young private with red hair and freckles, didn't understand Japanese. He looked to the side where a Nisei translator stood, a middle-aged man in a U.S. Army uniform with kind eyes. Sergeant Roy Nakamura smiled. It was a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. He spoke in perfect, unaccented Japanese. "There is no price. It is free. Take what you need." The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. 200 people stood in that tent, and not one of them breathed. Mrs. Miyamoto's hand reaching for the can of peaches froze in mid-air. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. "Free," she finally whispered the word, cracking in her throat. "Free," the translator confirmed, his smile never wavering. "Everything in this canteen is free for you, for your families. Take whatever you need." Mrs. Miyamoto took the can of peaches as if it were a live bomb. She cradled it against her chest like an infant and walked away, tears streaming down her weathered face. The line behind her erupted not in celebration, but in confused, frightened murmuring that rippled through the tent like wind through grass. This had to be a trick. It had to be. The demons were playing with them, making them take things so they could later be punished for theft. That's what the propaganda had taught them. That's what made sense in the world they understood. But no punishment came. Woman after woman, man after man walked to the counter and received goods. Free. No strings. No demands. No sneering cruelty. Just an impossible kindness that made no sense whatsoever. When Fumiko's turn came, her hands shook so badly she could barely point. She gestured at a can of peaches and a bar of soap. The translator handed them to her with that same warm smile. "Welcome," he said softly in Japanese. "You're safe here." Fumiko walked out of that tent in a daze. She clutched the can of peaches and the bar of soap against her chest and made her way back to Tent 7 on legs that felt like they might collapse at any moment. That night she lay on her cot, with the can of peaches resting beside her pillow. She didn't open it. It was too precious, too impossible. Opening it would make it real, and making it real would force her to confront questions that terrified her more than any American soldier ever could. If the Americans weren't demons, then what was the truth? If the Emperor's officers had lied about this, what else had they lied about? If surrender didn't mean torture and death, then what about all the people who had jumped from Marpi Point? What about the young mother with her baby? What about the old woman who had grabbed Fumiko's arm and begged her to die together? Had they all died for a lie? The questions were dangerous, treasonous, but they wouldn't stop coming. Around the tent, other women lay on their cots with their own treasures. A bar of soap, A can of pineapple, a sewing kit, small things, impossible things, things that whispered a truth louder than any propaganda. But in the corner, Reiko Ishida sat upright on her cot, her back perfectly straight, staring into the darkness with eyes that reflected no light at all. She had not gone to the canteen. She had not taken anything. And when Mrs. Miyamoto had offered to share her peaches, Reiko had turned away without a word. Fumiko watched her in the dim light filtering through the tent canvas, and for the first time she felt something other than fear when she looked at that cold, perfect figure. She felt pity, because what Fumiko was beginning to understand, what was slowly dawning on her with the weight of revelation, was that the canteen wasn't just about food. It wasn't even about kindness, not really. It was about proof. Overwhelming, undeniable, tangible proof that everything they had been taught was wrong. Every bar of soap was evidence. Every can of peaches was testimony. Every smile from a Nisei translator who spoke their language and understood their culture, but had chosen America anyway, all of it was building a case that couldn't be argued against, only accepted or rejected. And Fumiko, lying in the darkness with questions swirling through her mind like smoke, realized she had already made her choice. She didn't know when it had happened, maybe in the shell crater, when the Marine had used that concerned tone. Maybe when the medic had bandaged her feet with gentle hands. Maybe in the shower when she'd felt human again for the first time in months. Or maybe it was right now, holding an unopened can of peaches in the dark, understanding that accepting it meant accepting everything it represented. Tomorrow, she would open the can. She would taste the sweetness. And she would begin the hard work of rebuilding a worldview that had been shattered as completely as the bodies on the rocks below Marpi Point. But tonight, she just held it close and wondered if the young mother had known in that last, suspended moment before she stepped off the cliff that she was wrong. If there had been even a flicker of doubt as she fell. Fumiko hoped not. She hoped it had been fast and certain and convinced. Because the alternative, that all those people had died with questions in their hearts, was too terrible to bear. Across the tent, Reiko Ishida finally lay down, but her eyes remained open, staring at the canvas ceiling, and in the darkness her face was like carved stone, refusing to crack, refusing to break, refusing to accept the evidence that was drowning everyone around her. Tomorrow the canteen would open again, and the weapon of kindness would continue its quiet, devastating work bullet by bullet, can by can, until an entire empire's ideology lay in ruins at its feet. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Fumiko Nakamura held a can of peaches in the dark and felt the first trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to survive after all. Late August slipped into early September with the lazy inevitability of tropical heat. The transformation of Camp Susupe continued like a slow tide, impossible to stop reshaping everything it touched. Children who had cowered in corners now played elaborate games of tag between the tent rows. Women who had refused to speak now gathered in small groups, sharing stories, sharing tears, sharing the cautious beginning of something that might eventually become hope. But Fumiko Nakamura couldn't stop watching the woman who refused to change. Reiko Ishida sat in the same spot every day, her back against a palm tree just outside Tent 7, positioned where she could see the canteen entrance. She never joined the line, never accepted the goods that other women brought back to share. She just watched with those cutting eyes, silent and still, as a predator waiting for prey that would never come. And the more Fumiko watched her, the more wrong it felt. Everyone else in the camp was broken in some visible way, traumatized, grieving, slowly healing. But Reiko wasn't broken. She was intact, perfectly, unnaturally intact. Her posture was too good, her silence too controlled. Even her refusal of the canteen goods seemed calculated rather than emotional, a strategic choice rather than stubborn grief. This wasn't the behavior of a shattered civilian. This was the behavior of someone with training, someone with discipline, someone with a mission. Fumiko tried to dismiss the thought. She was being paranoid. Reiko was just a fanatic, a true believer who couldn't let go of the old ideology. There were a few others like her in the camp, though none quite so intense. It didn't mean anything sinister, but the feeling wouldn't go away. One evening in early September, Fumiko approached Mrs. Miyamoto as the old woman sat mending a torn blouse with thread from the canteen. "Do you know anything about her?" Fumiko asked quietly, nodding toward Reiko's still figure under the palm tree. Mrs. Miyamoto glanced up, then quickly looked away as if even discussing Reiko might draw her attention. "Nothing." Her registration said she was an administrator for the sugar company. No family listed, very quiet. The old woman paused, her needle frozen mid-stitch. Frightening, if I'm honest. Has she ever said anything about the battle, about where she was before? Not to me, not to anyone as far as I know. Mrs. Miyamoto lowered her voice to barely a whisper. Some of the other women think she might have been at Marpi Point, like you, that maybe she saw something that broke her mind in a way that won't heal. But that wasn't it. Fumiko had seen broken minds. She'd seen women who rocked themselves to sleep crying, men who woke screaming from nightmares, children who flinched at loud noises. That was trauma. That was the mind shattering under unbearable weight. Reiko wasn't shattered. She was sharp, focused, waiting. The next morning, Fumiko made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. She walked directly to Reiko's palm tree and sat down beside her without asking permission. Reiko's eyes flicked to her once briefly, then returned to watching the canteen entrance. They sat in silence for 5 minutes. 10. Fumiko's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to remain still, to match Reiko's patience with her own. Finally, Fumiko spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I was at Marpi Point too." Reiko's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes so fast, Fumiko almost missed it. Recognition, calculation. "I ran," Fumiko continued. "When everyone else was jumping, I ran. I suppose that makes me a traitor in some eyes." More silence. Then so quietly Fumiko almost didn't hear it. Reiko spoke. "I didn't run." Her voice was cold, precise. "I was ordered away." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered, that Fumiko almost believed it. Almost. But there was something in the way Reiko said it, a testing quality, like she was probing to see how Fumiko would react. "Ordered by whom?" Fumiko asked. "Does it matter? We're both here now, both alive when honor demanded death." Reiko's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Tell me, do the peaches taste sweet when you know what they cost?" Fumiko felt ice run down her spine. This wasn't grief talking. This was something else entirely. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. "I think they taste like truth, and I think that's what terrifies you." Reiko's eyes locked onto hers with sudden intensity. For a moment, Fumiko saw something flicker across that perfect mask. Anger, fear. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold stillness. Fumiko walked away on shaking legs, her mind racing. Something was very wrong with Reiko Ishida, and she had no idea what to do about it. The answer arrived that afternoon in the form of Lieutenant Kenji Hayashi. Fumiko first saw him near the administrative buildings, a Nisei officer in his mid-20s with an intelligent face and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He was speaking with one of the camp administrators, gesturing toward the tent areas with the easy authority of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. She probably wouldn't have thought twice about him, except for one thing. As she walked past, carrying a bundle of blankets from the supply tent, his gaze found her, then moved past her, to where Reiko sat under her palm tree, and his expression changed, just slightly. Just enough for Fumiko to see that he was thinking the same thing she was. Something about that woman doesn't fit. That evening, As Fumiko helped distribute dinner rations in the mess tent, the lieutenant approached her. "Excuse me, miss. May I speak with you for a moment?" His Japanese was perfect, unaccented, the language of someone who had grown up speaking it at home, even while living in America. Fumiko nodded, following him to a quieter corner of the tent. "My name is Lieutenant Kenji Hayashi, Naval Intelligence. I've been assigned to Camp Susupe to assist with prisoner processing and administration." He paused, studying her face. "You're Fumiko Nakamura, captured July 28th, civilian nursing assistant. You've been quite helpful to the other women in your tent, from what I understand." "I do what I can." Fumiko's voice was guarded. An intelligence officer wanting to speak with her couldn't mean anything good. "I've noticed you watching one of your tent mates, Reiko Ishida." It wasn't a question. "Why?" Fumiko hesitated. Saying her suspicions out loud would make them real. And if she was wrong, if Reiko was just a traumatized woman clinging to the old ways, then Fumiko would be guilty of the kind of paranoid accusation that the Kempei Tai thought police had used to destroy so many innocent lives back home. But Lieutenant Hayashi was waiting, and something in his expression told her he already knew. He was just waiting to see if she'd figured it out too. "She doesn't fit," Fumiko said finally. "Everyone else here is broken or healing. She's neither. She watches everything, counts things, guard rotations. How many people go to the canteen and when? She sits in the same spot every day where she has clear sight lines to the camp center." Fumiko took a breath. "And she's too controlled, too disciplined. It's not natural for someone who survived what we survived." Kenji nodded slowly. "You see it too. I was hoping I was wrong, but I needed confirmation from someone who lives with her." He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Her file is wrong. Too clean. 4 pages when everyone else has 40. No family connections, no real background. It's what we call a ghost file. Someone created it to hide something. Who is she really? That's what I'm trying to find out, but I can't interrogate her without destroying everything we're building here." He gestured toward the canteen, toward the women sharing their free soap and canned goods, toward the children laughing as they played. "This strategy, this weapon of kindness, it's working. Prisoners are starting to believe the propaganda was lies. They're starting to trust us. If I pull her out for intensive questioning, word will spread instantly. The Americans were lying after all. They are interrogators and torturers. Everything we've built collapses." Fumiko understood. She also understood what he was about to ask. "You want me to watch her, woman to woman, get close to her if I can. I know it's dangerous. If she is what I think she might be, she could be extremely dangerous. But you're already watching her. You've already started making contact." Kenji's expression softened slightly. "I've read your file too, Miss Nakamura. Marpi Point, shell crater, 19 days in the jungle. You survived when thousands didn't. You're stronger than you think." Fumiko wanted to laugh at that. Stronger. She was a 22-year-old nursing assistant who'd run from a cliff while mothers jumped with their babies. She had nightmares every single night. She woke up shaking and crying and had to stuff her blanket in her mouth so the other women wouldn't hear. But she thought about the canteen, about Mrs. Miyamoto's tears over a can of peaches, about little Tetsuo finally smiling after tasting chocolate, about the weapon of kindness that was slowly, patiently dismantling an empire's ideology, one free bar of soap at a time. If Reiko was a threat to that, then someone had to stop her. What do I do if I find something? Come to me immediately. Don't confront her alone. Don't try to be a hero. Kenji handed her a small piece of paper with a tent number written on it. "That's my office. If you see anything at all, you find me." Fumiko took the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her pocket. "What do you think she is?" Kenji was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was grim. "I think she might be Kempei Tai, or connected to them somehow, but I can't prove it. Not yet." "The Kempei Tai." The Emperor's thought police, the monsters who'd enforced absolute obedience through terror and torture, the ones who'd shot soldiers trying to surrender, who'd herded civilians to the cliffs at Marpi Point. Fumiko felt her mouth go dry. And if she is, then we have a very dangerous woman living among 20,000 prisoners, maintaining perfect cover and planning something we can't even guess at yet. He met her eyes. Which is why I need you to help me figure out what that something is before it happens. The next week passed in a strange dual existence. On the surface, Fumiko continued her normal routine, helping in the mess tent, distributing canteen goods to newcomers who were still too frightened to go themselves. Sitting with Mrs. Miyamoto in the evenings, listening to the old woman's stories about her grandchildren back in Hiroshima, but underneath she was watching, always watching. And what she saw chilled her to the bone. Reiko had a pattern. Every morning at dawn she would walk the perimeter of their section, always taking the same path, always at the same time. She would pause at certain points, her head tilted slightly as if listening. Fumiko realized she was timing the guard changes, memorizing the exact moment when one American soldier would walk away and another would take his place. In the afternoons, Reiko would sit at her palm tree and watch the canteen. But she wasn't just watching randomly. Her eyes would track specific people, the Nisei translators especially. Fumiko noticed that Reiko paid particular attention to how much Japanese they spoke, whether their accents were pure or Americanized. She was assessing them, categorizing them, looking for weaknesses. And at night, when she thought everyone was asleep, Reiko would take out a small piece of paper and write on it by moonlight. Quick notes in what looked like a personal shorthand. Then she would fold it carefully and hide it in the lining of her mattress. Fumiko reported all of this to Lieutenant Hayashi in a series of brief meetings over the course of 10 days. Each time, his expression grew grimmer. "She's conducting intelligence gathering," he said during their 4th meeting. "Professional level. This isn't a civilian who's paranoid or scared. This is someone with training. Can you search her belongings, find the papers? Not without alerting her and destroying camp morale. If we raid a tent, especially at night, it confirms every fear these people have about us." Kenji ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I need to know who she is before I can decide what to do about her." That night, Kenji didn't sleep. Fumiko knew this because the next morning when she saw him across the mess tent, he looked like death. But there was something else in his expression, a terrible certainty. He found her after breakfast, his face carefully neutral. "Can you meet me at my office? Now." The intelligence office was a small Quonset hut that turned into an oven during the day. Inside, papers covered every surface. Maps of Saipan, prisoner registration forms, interrogation transcripts, and spread across the desk, water-damaged documents covered in Japanese military script. "I found it," Kenji said quietly. "It took me 3 nights of going through captured Kempeitai rosters, but I found it." He pointed to a partial roster dated April 1944. Near the bottom in a section labeled Special Administrative Personnel was a single entry that made Fumiko's blood turn to ice. Subject R. Ishida. Classification Protected Asset. Direct Authority. Colonel Takeshi Ishida, Commander. Security Level Absolute. "Ishida," Fumiko whispered. "Not Hayashi." She changed her name. Her father changed it for her in May 1944, when it became clear Saipan might fall. He arranged civilian documentation, a cover identity. Kenji pulled out another document, this one a personnel file. Colonel Takeshi Ishida was the commander of the Saipan Kempeitai from 1942 until his death during the final battle. He was personally responsible for executing dozens of suspected collaborators. He organized the Banzai charges that killed thousands of Japanese soldiers in futile human wave attacks. And on July the 9th, he was one of the officers at Marpi Point ensuring civilians jumped Fumiko felt the room spin. She grabbed the edge of the desk to steady herself. The officer with the sword, the one who called me traitor when I ran? Probably. He committed suicide with a grenade sometime in the final hours rather than face capture. Kenji's voice was gentle, despite the horror of what he was describing. Reiko Ishida is his daughter, the princess of the Kempei-tai, and she's been living in Tent 7 for 6 weeks, watching everything, refusing to break, maintaining perfect discipline. What is she planning? I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe she's just maintaining cover out of pure ideological stubbornness. Or maybe she's gathering intelligence for something we can't even imagine yet. Kenji looked at Fumiko with an expression that was almost apologetic. The Kempei-tai were trained in sabotage, assassination, creating chaos even without weapons. A skilled operative with determination could cause significant damage. Then arrest her, interrogate her, find out what she knows, and destroy everything. Kenji gestured toward the window, toward the camp where thousands of prisoners were slowly learning to trust their captors. Right now we have something unprecedented. A prison camp where the prisoners are voluntarily transforming their ideology, where children are laughing again, where women feel safe enough to take free soap and actually believe it's free. If I pull Reiko out for interrogation, all of that dies. The whisper goes through the camp instantly. The Americans were lying. They do torture. They are exactly what we were told. So what do we do? Just let her stay there. Let her plan whatever she's planning. Kenji was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had cost him sleep and possibly his career. I'm going to make a gamble. A bigger gamble than anything I've ever done in my life. He met Fumiko's eyes. I'm going to let the weapon of kindness do its work. I'm going to trust that seeing the truth day after day, week after week, will be more powerful than a lifetime of Kempei-tai indoctrination. And I'm going to ask you to help me. How? Keep watching her. But more than that, talk to her. Share your own transformation with her. Show her that accepting the truth doesn't make you a traitor. It makes you human. Kenji's expression was intense. You're both survivors of Marpi Point. You both ran when you were told to jump. You have more in common with her than anyone else in this camp. If anyone can reach her, it's you. And if I can't, if she really is planning something, then you come to me immediately and I'll do what I have to do. Consequences be damned. He paused. But I don't think it will come to that. I've been watching her too, Miss Nakamura, and I see something you might have missed because you're too close to it. What? Fear. She's terrified. Not of the Americans, of being wrong, of discovering that everything her father taught her, everything he stood for, was a lie. That's why she won't go to the canteen. That's why she maintains that perfect discipline. Because the moment she accepts a free can of peaches, she has to accept that her father was a monster who sent thousands of people to their deaths for nothing. Fumiko thought about that, about the young mother stepping off the cliff with her baby, about the old woman grabbing her arm, about the screaming that wasn't honorable or brave, just terrified. Her father was at Marpi Point. He made them jump. Yes. And she knows it. Yes. So every day she refuses the canteen. Every day she maintains her discipline. She's choosing her father over the truth. Exactly. Kenji's voice was sad. She's not evil, Miss Nakamura. She's trapped. And I'm betting everything that kindness can free her. But I can't do it alone. I need you to be the bridge. Woman to woman. Survivor to survivor. Will you do it? Fumiko thought about saying no, about going back to her cot and her can of peaches and letting someone else deal with the Kempei-tai princess. She'd survived Marpi Point. She'd survived the jungle. She'd survived her own transformation from true believer to questioning survivor. Wasn't that enough? But then she thought about Mrs. Miyamoto's tears, about Tetsuo's smile, About all the women in Tent 7 who were slowly, painfully learning to live again. If Reiko destroyed that, whether through sabotage or simply through her silent resistance infecting others with doubt, then Fumiko would never forgive herself for not trying. "I'll do it," she said, "but I want to know one thing first. What if I'm putting myself between a Kempe Tai operative and 20,000 prisoners? I want to know why you believe kindness will work. Really, not strategy, not psychology. Why do you believe it?" Kenji looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled up his sleeve, revealing a number tattooed on his forearm. A prisoner number from Manzanar internment camp. "Because I was on the other side of it," he said quietly. "My family lost everything in 1942. Home, business, freedom. We were American citizens imprisoned by our own government for no crime except our ancestry. And I had every reason to hate this country, to reject it, to become exactly the kind of threat they feared we were. But you didn't. No, because even in that camp there were kindnesses, small ones. A guard who slipped my mother extra blankets when she was sick, a teacher who made sure the children still had school, a camp director who fought to get us better rations. Those small acts of humanity, they saved me from becoming a monster of hate." He looked toward the window again. "I'm not naive, Miss Nakamura. Kindness doesn't fix everything. Justice still matters. Truth still matters. But kindness creates the space where transformation becomes possible. That's what we're doing here, creating space. Hoping it's enough." Fumiko nodded slowly. "Then I'll help you create that space, and we'll see if the daughter of a monster can become something else." "Thank you." Kenji's relief was visible. "But please be careful. If you see anything that suggests she's planning violence, you come to me immediately. Don't try to stop her yourself." "I understand." As Fumiko left the Quonset hut and walked back toward the tent areas, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly, she felt the weight of what she'd agreed to settle onto her shoulders. She was now the only barrier between a Kempitai agent and thousands of vulnerable prisoners, the only bridge between a daughter's loyalty and the truth about her father's evil. It should have terrified her, and it did. But underneath the fear was something else. Something she hadn't felt since before the war started. Purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was protecting. She was building. She was part of the weapon of kindness, and that weapon was changing the world, one free can of peaches at a time. Across the camp, under her palm tree, Reiko Ishida sat watching the canteen entrance with eyes like chips of ice. Counting, calculating, waiting. But what she didn't know was that she was being watched right back. And the quiet nursing assistant she'd dismissed as another broken collaborator was about to become the most dangerous opponent she'd ever faced. Not because Fumiko had weapons or training or authority, but because Fumiko had something more powerful than any of that. She had the truth, and she was no longer afraid to speak it. October came to Saipan with the subtle shift that marked the changing of seasons in the tropics. The heat remained, but the quality of light changed softer somehow, as if even the sun understood that something fundamental was shifting in Camp Susupe. The transformation was undeniable now. What had begun as cautious acceptance had bloomed into something approaching normalcy. The morning canteen line was no longer a procession of frightened ghosts, but a social gathering where women chatted about recipes they planned to try with their free cooking oil, where men discussed the possibility of growing vegetables in small plots the Americans had designated for that purpose. Fumiko had become almost without noticing a bridge between the old world and the new. She helped newcomers navigate the camp, explaining in gentle tones that, yes, the soap was really free, and no, there was no punishment for taking it. She assisted in the medical tent, her nursing training finally put to use again, working alongside American doctors who treated her not as an enemy, but as a colleague. Mrs. Miyamoto had taken to calling her daughter, and Fumiko found she didn't mind. Her real mother was dead, her father was dead, her brother was dead. But here in this strange prison camp where kindness was a weapon, she was building something that felt almost like family. Almost. Because every day from her spot under the palm tree, Reiko Ishida watched with eyes that never softened, never warmed, never changed. Fumiko had tried twice more to approach her. Both times, Reiko had responded with cold politeness that was somehow more cutting than outright hostility. She would answer direct questions with minimal words, volunteer nothing, and then return to her silent observation as if Fumiko had never been there at all. Lieutenant Hayashi met with Fumiko weekly now, their conversations brief and always in public places where they wouldn't draw attention. Each time, Fumiko reported the same thing. Reiko was still watching, still counting, still writing her notes by moonlight, but she had done nothing overtly threatening. She was simply there, a ghost of the old ideology, haunting a camp full of people, trying desperately to leave that ideology behind. "She's weakening," Kenji said during their meeting in mid-October. They stood near the mess tent, ostensibly discussing food distribution, actually discussing the fate of a Kempeitai princess. "Did you notice she attended the memorial service last week?" Fumiko had noticed. A group of women from their section had organized a small ceremony to honor those who died during the battle and at Marpi Point. They'd made paper flowers and origami cranes, sung Buddhist prayers, created a small shrine with photographs and personal items. Reiko had stood at the very back of the gathering, partially hidden behind a tent. She hadn't participated, hadn't sung or prayed or cried like the other women, but she'd been there, and for Reiko that meant something. "She's watching them grieve," Fumiko said, "watching them process their losses in public. It's probably the first time she's seen real emotion that wasn't controlled or weaponized. Her father wouldn't have allowed public grieving. The Kempeitai considered it weakness, lack of fighting spirit." Kenji's voice was thoughtful. "She's seeing something she was never permitted to see before. People being human. Is it enough? I don't know, but it's something." That night, Fumiko was awakened by a sound she couldn't immediately place, a soft, rhythmic noise coming from somewhere in the tent. She lay still, listening, trying to identify it. Someone was crying. Not the loud, gasping sobs that sometimes echoed through the tent when someone woke from nightmares. This was quiet, controlled, almost silent. The crying of someone who'd been trained their entire life never to show weakness, fighting desperately not to make a sound. It was coming from Reiko's cot. Fumiko sat up slowly, careful not to wake the other women. In the dim moonlight filtering through the canvas, she could see Reiko's silhouette. She was sitting upright, as always, back perfectly straight, but her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs, and her hand covered her mouth as if she could physically push the grief back inside. For a long moment, Fumiko just watched. This was the crack Kenji had predicted. The moment when the perfect discipline finally broke under the weight of accumulated evidence. Fumiko stood and crossed the tent quietly. She sat down on the edge of Reiko's cot without asking permission. Reiko stiffened immediately, the crying cutting off with surgical precision. "Don't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't speak to me. Don't comfort me. Just go back to sleep." "I can't," Fumiko said simply. "I can't watch you suffer alone." "I'm not suffering. I'm fine." "You're crying." "I am not." Even in the darkness, Fumiko could see Reiko's jaw clench with the effort of maintaining control. "Go away." "No." The single word hung between them. Fumiko half expected Reiko to lash out, to attack, to do something violent. Instead, the woman seemed to collapse inward, her perfect posture finally crumbling. "They're all so happy," Reiko whispered. "The women, the children, they're learning to be happy here, in a prison camp, with the enemy." "How can they do that?" "Because the enemy isn't what we were told." "I know that!" The words burst out of Reiko with sudden violence, quickly muffled. Don't you think I know that I've been watching them for months? I've seen the chocolate bars and the medicine and the free soap and all of it. I know it's real. I know the propaganda was lies. Then why won't you accept it? Reiko turned to look at Fumiko directly for the first time. In the moonlight, her face was ravaged, tears streaming down her cheeks, her carefully maintained mask finally shattered. Because if I accept it, then my father was a monster. Every person who jumped from Marpi Point died for nothing. Every soldier he sent on suicide charges, every civilian he executed for cowardice, every order he gave, all of it was evil. Her voice broke. He was my father. He was all I had left. And if I accept that free can of peaches, I have to accept that he was a murderer who destroyed thousands of lives for an ideology built on lies. Fumiko felt tears on her own cheeks. I understand. How could you possibly understand? Because I ran from that cliff, and every day since I've had to live with the knowledge that the woman who jumped with her baby, the old woman who begged me to die with her, they all died believing a lie, and I could have saved them. If I'd been brave enough to speak the truth, if I'd questioned earlier, maybe I could have convinced even one person not to jump. You couldn't have saved them. Neither could you. Fumiko reached out slowly, giving Reiko time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, Fumiko took her hand. Your father made his choices. The Emperor's officers made their choices. We can't carry their guilt. We can only choose differently going forward. Reiko's hand was cold in hers, trembling. I don't know how to be different. This is all I know: discipline, loyalty, service to the Emperor. Without that, who am I? You're Reiko, just Reiko, and that's enough. They sat like that for a long time, two survivors of Marpi Point holding hands in the darkness, one finally breaking, and the other strong enough to catch her when she fell. When Reiko finally spoke again, her voice was small. If I go to the canteen tomorrow, will you come with me? Yes. And if I take something, if I accept their kindness, will you tell me it's not betrayal? It's not betrayal. It's truth, and truth is the only way we honor the dead, by living honestly. Reiko nodded slowly. Then, in a gesture that must have cost her everything, she leaned against Fumiko's shoulder and let herself cry, without trying to hide it. The sound was heartbreaking, years of suppressed grief finally finding release. Mrs. Miyamoto stirred in her sleep, but didn't wake. The other women slept on, unaware that the ghost haunting their tent was finally becoming human. The next morning dawned clear and hot. Fumiko woke early, uncertain if the previous night had been real or some strange dream. But when she looked over at Reiko's cot, the woman was already awake, sitting on the edge of her mattress, staring at her hands. I'm afraid, Reiko said, without preamble. I know. So was I. What if I can't do it? What if I get to the canteen and freeze? Then we leave and try again tomorrow. There's no timeline for healing. But when the canteen opened at 9 o'clock that morning, Reiko stood up with visible effort and walked toward it. Fumiko fell into step beside her, aware that every woman in Tent 7 was watching this unprecedented development. The line was shorter than usual late morning rather than the early rush. They stood together in silence, Reiko's breathing quick and shallow, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The line moved slowly. With each step forward, Fumiko felt Reiko's breathing grow more shallow beside her. When they finally reached the counter, Sergeant Nakamura's eyes widened slightly in recognition. He'd seen Reiko watching from her palm tree for months. He'd probably wondered, like everyone else, if she would ever come. Good morning, he said gently, his tone carefully neutral, giving Reiko space. Reiko's mouth opened, but no sound came. Her hand lifted toward the stacked cans, then dropped. Fumiko saw her jaw clench, saw the war happening behind her eyes between everything she'd been taught and everything she'd witnessed. Fumiko stepped closer, not quite touching, but near enough that Reiko could feel her presence. A silent reminder, you're not alone in this. Peaches, Reiko finally said. Not a whisper this time, but quiet and clear. Please. Nakamura didn't smile or make a ceremony of it. He simply reached back, selected a can, and placed it in her hands. "Welcome," he said softly. Reiko stared down at the can. Her hands weren't shaking like Fumiko had expected. They were steady, certain, as if she'd already made peace with what this meant. They walked back to Tent 7 in silence, but it was a different silence than before. Not the cold, cutting silence of resistance, but the quiet of someone processing something too large for words. That evening, as the sun set over the Pacific, Reiko opened the can of peaches. She did it slowly, carefully, as if it were a religious ritual. The smell of the sweet syrup filled the tent, making several women look over with interest. Reiko lifted one piece of peach to her mouth, closed her eyes, took a bite, and wept. Not quiet, controlled crying this time. Open, gasping sobs that shook her entire body. She ate the peach slice and cried, ate another, and cried harder. The sweetness she'd denied herself for months, the kindness she'd rejected, the truth she'd fought against, all of it crashing over her at once. Mrs. Miyamoto approached cautiously, carrying her own can of peaches. Without a word, she sat down beside Reiko and began to eat her own peaches in solidarity. Then another woman joined them, then another, until half the tent was sitting in a circle eating peaches together, some crying, some smiling, all of them understanding that something sacred was happening. The weapon of kindness had claimed its most resistant victim. Later that night, Fumiko found Lieutenant Hayashi near the administrative buildings. "She went to the canteen today," Fumiko reported. "She accepted peaches, and she broke. Completely broke." Kenji closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over his face. Thank God. I was beginning to think I'd made a terrible mistake. There's something else. She wants to help. She came to me after dinner and said she wants to write letters to Japan, testimonials about the camps, about the Americans. She said if her father's name, might convince even one person to surrender instead of dying, then maybe, Fumiko trailed off. Maybe her father didn't win after all, Kenji finished. That's incredibly brave of her and strategically valuable. Letters from the daughter of a Kempeitai commander would carry enormous weight. He paused. But I need to interview her officially first. Make sure she understands what she's offering and that she's not still trying to run some kind of operation. She's not. I'm certain of it. I believe you, but I still need to do my job. He smiled slightly. You did it, Miss Nakamura. You reached her when I thought it might be impossible. We reached her. The canteen, the children, Mrs. Miyamoto, all of us. That's how the weapon works, right? Not one person, but accumulated evidence from everywhere. True, but you were the bridge. Don't underestimate what you've accomplished. The weeks that followed saw Reiko's transformation accelerate. She began attending the evening gatherings where women shared stories. She helped in the mess tent. She smiled hesitantly at first, then with growing ease when children ran past, playing their games. And in early December, when 8-year-old Akari fell ill with pneumonia, Reiko was one of the first to volunteer to sit vigil. Fumiko had grown close to Akari over the months. The little girl had been orphaned during the battle, both parents killed, and Mrs. Miyamoto had taken her in as a temporary guardian. Akari was small for her age, serious and quiet, but with a smile that could light up a tent when something genuinely delighted her. When she fell ill, that smile disappeared, replaced by labored breathing, burning fever, and the terrifying stillness of a child too sick to even cry. Mrs. Miyamoto was beside herself. The doctors say they have medicine, but what if it doesn't work? What if I lose her too? Captain Ruth Miller, one of the American doctors, was matter-of-fact and confident. The antibiotics we have are excellent. We caught it early. She'll be fine, but it will take a few days. But 3 days felt like 3 years when a child was struggling to breathe. Fumiko spent every free hour in the medical tent sitting beside Akari's bed, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, singing soft lullabies in Japanese. Mrs. Miyamoto rarely left dozing in a chair, starting awake at every sound. Akari made. On the second day, Reiko appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a long time, watching through the canvas opening. Fumiko could see her face clearly in the afternoon light. She was watching Captain Miller check Akari's temperature with a thermometer, adjust her IV fluids, listen to her lungs with a stethoscope, all of it done with professional competence and genuine care. Finally, Reiko stepped inside. She didn't speak to Mrs. Miyamoto or Fumiko. She simply pulled up a chair on the opposite side of Akari's bed and sat down. Her back was straight, as always her hands folded in her lap, but she was there, participating in the communal care of a child she barely knew simply because that child needed help and Reiko could offer presence, if nothing else. They sat like that for hours. Mrs. Miyamoto dozing, Fumiko singing Reiko, watching in silence as American medicine worked its slow magic. On the fourth day, Akari's fever broke. The little girl's eyes opened clearer than they'd been in days. She looked around the tent, confused, until her gaze found Mrs. Miyamoto. "Oba-chan," she whispered. "Grandmother." Mrs. Miyamoto burst into tears, gathering the child into a gentle embrace. Captain Miller smiled, making notes on her chart. "There we go. Crisis over. She'll need a few more days of rest, but she's going to be fine." Fumiko watched Reiko's face during all of this, watched as the woman witnessed a child saved by enemy medicine, cared for by enemy doctors, crying with joy, in the arms of a woman who had every reason to hate Americans but had learned to trust them instead. When Reiko stood to leave, her face had changed. The mask was gone. In its place was something Fumiko recognized from her own reflection in the camp mirrors, the exhausted relief of someone who'd been carrying impossible weight and finally set it down. She stopped beside Fumiko on her way out. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not giving up on me, for showing me that transformation was possible." "We all needed showing," Fumiko replied. "None of us could have done this alone." That night, Reiko asked to speak with Lieutenant Hayashi. The meeting was brief and formal, but the result was permission for Reiko to begin writing testimonial letters under Kenji's supervision, letters that would be censored for security, but allowed to carry the basic truth. The camps were humane. The Americans were not demons. Surrender was not death. Some of those letters made it to Japan through Red Cross channels. Whether they changed any minds, whether they convinced any soldiers to lay down their weapons or any civilians to surrender rather than commit suicide, no one could say for certain. But in February 1945, when American forces landed on Iwo Jima, 216 Japanese soldiers surrendered. A tiny number compared to the 18,000 who died, but infinitely more than the near-zero surrender rate of previous battles. In April, when the battle for Okinawa began, over 7,000 Japanese military personnel surrendered. Thousands of civilians allowed themselves to be captured rather than jumping from cliffs or drowning themselves in the sea. The weapon of kindness launched from a tent in Camp Susupe rippled across the Pacific like invisible waves, changing the calculus of desperation, one person at a time. December the 24th, 1944, Christmas Eve in Camp Susupe. The Americans had decorated the canteen tent with paper chains the children had made, colorful links that danced in the tropical breeze. Someone had found a small palm tree and turned it into an improvised Christmas tree hung with origami cranes donated by the Japanese prisoners. Fumiko stood in line with Mrs. Miyamoto and Akari, who was fully recovered, and chattering excitedly about the candy canes she'd heard the Americans were giving out. Behind them, Reiko waited patiently, no longer separate, just another woman in the line. When they reached the counter, Sergeant Nakamura was wearing a Santa hat someone had sent from the States. "Merry Christmas, ladies. We've got something special today. Fresh oranges just arrived." Mrs. Miyamoto gasped. Fresh fruit was rare, precious. Really fresh. Really fresh. And before you ask, yes, they're free. Nakamura grinned. "Everything's always free." "When are you going to learn that?" Akari laughed, and the sound was like bells. Fumiko took her oranges and felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, not yet, but something approaching it. The knowledge that she'd survived, that she'd helped others survive, that she'd been part of something larger than herself. As they walked back to their tent, arms full of oranges and candy canes and the small treasures of Christmas in a prison camp, Fumiko looked back at the canteen. The line stretched long, full of people who had learned to accept kindness, who had learned that their enemies were human, who had learned that propaganda was just words, and truth was in the actions of young men who shared their chocolate, and doctors who saved children, and translators who smiled with genuine warmth. The war wasn't over. Japan would fight for 8 more months before the atomic bombs and Soviet invasion forced surrender, but the outcome was already decided. An empire built on lies about racial superiority and divine destiny couldn't survive confrontation with simple, persistent truth. The can of peaches had worked. The bar of soap had worked. The weapon of kindness had worked in ways that bombs and bullets never could, destroying not bodies, but beliefs, shattering not cities, but certainties. That night, as Fumiko lay on her cot with a fresh orange resting on her pillow, she thought about Lieutenant Hayashi's question from months ago. Would you trust kindness or demand justice? She understood now that it wasn't an either-or choice. Kindness created the space where justice became possible. It broke down the walls that made enemies into monsters. It reminded everyone involved that they were human first, combatants second. In 1946, Fumiko Nakamura returned to Japan. The country she found was unrecognizable. Cities in ruins, people starving, the emperor's divine status renounced. Everything she'd known as a child transformed or destroyed. But along with the devastation came something unexpected. The American occupation, led by General MacArthur, followed the same principles as Camp Susupe: reconstruction rather than revenge, respect rather than humiliation, democracy rather than subjugation. Fumiko found work teaching nursing at a girls' school in Hiroshima. The city was still rebuilding from the atomic bomb, still scarred beyond recognition. But children still needed education. The sick still needed care. Life continued with stubborn persistence. One day in early spring, a woman walked into her classroom and asked if there was a position available for an assistant instructor. It was Reiko. They stared at each other for a long moment, then Fumiko smiled. "Can you teach basic first aid? My father made sure I had that training for the war effort." "Then the position is yours, but I have one condition." Reiko weighted tension in her shoulders. "We keep a reminder of where we came from, of what changed us." Fumiko reached into her desk drawer and pulled out an empty can of peaches. The label was faded, the tin dented and worn from being carried across the Pacific and back. But it was unmistakably the same can Mrs. Miyamoto had taken that first day in August 1944, which she'd later given to Fumiko as a gift. "We keep this on the desk, so we never forget that kindness is the most powerful weapon we have." Reiko's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I'd like that." They taught together for 3 years. Every morning before the students arrived, one of them would place the empty peach can on the desk where everyone could see it. And when students asked what it meant, they would tell them the story. Not a story about war or victory or defeat. A story about the day when enemies proved they were human by offering free peaches to people who'd been taught to fear them. A story about how truth, delivered with kindness, could shatter the strongest ideology. A story about how sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to be kind when cruelty would be easier. Years later, historians would debate the effectiveness of the psychological warfare conducted at Camp Susupe. They would argue about statistics and strategy and whether kindness actually changed surrender rates or if it was just a footnote to larger military victories. But on a spring morning in 1949, Fumiko Nakamura stood in front of her classroom in Hiroshima, the empty peach can catching the sunlight on her desk, and knew the answer in a way no historian ever could. A student raised her hand. "Nakamura-sensei, my grandmother says Americans are our friends now, but my grandfather still won't speak to them. Why?" Fumiko glanced at Reiko, who was organizing bandages at the supply table. Their eyes met. 1,000 unspoken memories passed between them in that single look. Marpi Point, the cliff, the canteen, the night Reiko finally broke, the letters, Akari's recovery, the long journey home. "Because transformation is a choice," Fumiko said gently. "Your grandfather saw the same evidence your grandmother did, the same kindness, the same proof that what we'd been taught was wrong. But he chose to hold on to the old story. Your grandmother chose to accept a new one." She picked up the empty peach can, its label faded almost to illegibility. Neither choice is easy, but only one allows healing. The student frowned, thinking, "Which choice did you make, sensei?" Fumiko looked out the window at Hiroshima, still rebuilding, still scarred, but alive with the stubborn persistence of cherry blossoms pushing through rubble. She thought about the young mother stepping off the cliff with her baby, the old woman who'd grabbed her arm, the officer who'd called her traitor. And then she thought about Mrs. Miyamoto's tears over a can of peaches, Tetsuo's first smile after tasting chocolate, Akari calling her Oba-chan, Reiko's hand, cold and trembling, finally reaching out in the dark. "I chose to believe that my enemies were human," she said quietly, "and that changed everything." After class, as students filed out, chattering about their assignments, Reiko approached Fumiko's desk. She picked up the empty peach can, turned it over in her hands. The same can Mrs. Miyamoto had taken that first day. The same can that had traveled across an ocean and back, carried through devastation and occupation and reconstruction. "Do you ever regret it?" Reiko asked. "Running from the cliff, choosing to live when honor demanded death." Fumiko thought about that question. She'd asked it of herself 1,000 times in the dark, in nightmares, in moments when the guilt threatened to drown her. "Every day," she said honestly. "I regret that I couldn't save them, that I didn't question the propaganda earlier, that I ran instead of fighting to stop the madness." She paused. "But I don't regret surviving, because survival gave me the chance to do this." She gestured at the classroom, at the students' notebooks filled with lessons on healing at the world they were building together. Reiko set the can back on the desk carefully, almost reverently. "My father would call us traitors." "Yes," Fumiko agreed. "He would. But our students will call us teachers. Their children will call us wise. And the mothers whose children we save with the skills we teach them will call us heroes." She met Reiko's eyes. "I know which judgment matters more." Through the window, they could see students walking home through Hiroshima's streets. Japanese and American flags hung side by side from buildings. Former enemies working together to rebuild. The impossible made mundane through daily repetition. The can of peaches worked. Not because it was magic, not because it solved everything, but because it proved a simple truth that changed the world. Your enemy is human. And once you accept that everything else becomes possible, one person, one choice, one small act of kindness at a time. The weapon wasn't the kindness itself, it was the space that kindness created, the possibility it opened, the transformation it allowed for those brave enough to reach for it. And on a spring morning in Hiroshima, with cherry blossoms falling like snow outside the window and an empty peach can sitting on a teacher's desk, that transformation continued its quiet work, one student at a time.